You're listening to Let's Talk on Talk Radio Europe. Now, here's a very, very interesting book. Father of the MP3 Player is a story of Nathan Schulhof and the many experiences that have led him to changing the world through disruptive technology. You may not have heard of Nathan, but he's responsible for much of what we take for granted today, including downloading and streaming music and video, amongst many, many other things. I'm delighted to welcome Nathan to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Particularly interesting for me, this, Nathan, as in a previous life, I'm a record producer and songwriter. So to talk about somebody who was regarded as the father of the MP3 player is particularly interesting for me.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And let's talk about this MP3 player, because it really was a device ahead of its time. Is that fair to say?
You know, it was. And that's one of the problems with young entrepreneurs. We're always ahead of our time, and we're a little too early sometimes. And yes, it was. I started it in 1994, and computers were not in everybody's home, and the ones that did have them were using a phone line.
Right. And what was it that prompted you to come up with this device? Because at that time, of course, music compression, what were MP3s, were not the norm at all.
Right. I didn't invent the compression MP3. I invented the player, the MP3 player, and actually did the first music download and the first music cybercast. When I filed my patents back in 1994, we filed them so any compression that we use on these devices were covered by our patents, and we chose the compression MP3. When I had just finished a company in 1992 called Test Drive, which I sold to a very large conglomerate called R.R. Donnelley and Sons out of Chicago. And what Test Drive did was put $50,000 worth of software on a CD from all the leading companies, and users could try it several times. Then it would lock up, and they could buy it over the phone. They would be given an encryption, and all of a sudden it would start working. Well, after I sold the company, I thought, well, what should I do next? I really didn't want to get a job, as they say. And I thought, well, if I can do this with software, we should be able to do it with music. Back in those days, if you recall, you had to buy a whole, what they call album, even though it came on a tape, just to get one song. And I thought, well, you should be able to create your own playlist. And I also saw the vision of where computers and this big pipeline was going. And believe it or not, back then I even saw high-speed networks, and I could see this, and I knew I wanted to be a part of it. And boom,
Wow.
Sprang the MP3 player several years later.
So the device we're talking about here, it basically was a portable music player that held a single hour of content. It interrupted you every 30 seconds with advertisements, and it was $299. But this is back in 1996, and it was absolutely unique. It was called the Listen Up Player. And so what happened to the Listen Up Player?
Well, actually, someone can see a picture on it if you just Google Listen Up
Yes,
Player.
I'm looking at it, yeah.
But after about a year of producing it and selling it, where I saw this was going, quite frankly, was embedded devices. I didn't want to make the hardware. I wanted to be the back end. I actually saw the vision of, in the future, this being in telephones and other portable devices. You see, when I first started this, my vision was to replace a device that was huge back then called the Sony Walkman.
I had a recording Sony Walkman, Nathan. I was a real techno geek.
Everybody had a Sony Walkman.
Yeah, but I had the one that recorded.
The MP3 player. And all these stories are in my book, which is called Father of the MP3 Player, available on Amazon. And I wrote this book. I'm not a writer. I got a writer to help me, John Seeley, my co-author. And the first half of the book really tells stories about, how I started a company and built a $600 million company when I didn't have any money, how I funded it, how I manufactured it. But the second half is very, very personal. I probably got more personal than I would today. How I went into a coma because I was working so hard and ended up with the same virus Jim Henson, the Muppets man, had. Only I lived. But the recovery coming out was unbelievable, and my 8-year recovery and how it changed my life. It ended up in Mexico.
So back to this original start here, because this is something which, of course, has now taken hold of the world. And it was Apple who had the success with the MP3 player. The iPod and iTunes was that success. And that actually, some would say, it certainly changed the music industry, but it was the start of the demise of the music industry in a way.
Totally, yes. The MP3 player was out years before, few years before, and Apple was the one who really made it successful. And some people even don't realize that the iPod was an MP3 player. But the reason was Apple figured it out and gave the complete picture. They gave a plug and play. They had enough money, and the installed base at that time became large enough where they could go to the record companies. And the record companies were no longer afraid to do business with the online people, or let's say not as afraid. Yeah. The Tower Records were going away. Up till then, this was their bread and butter. So they were ready to make the transformation, and Apple did it right. They made it easy, so you could buy it, turn it on, and it had to be like turning on your TV. Prior to this, you had sites like LimeWire and these Renegade sites and Napster, where you had to be a little bit technical. And real users don't want to be technical. Yeah. They want to turn it on and turn to channel 2.
Yep. Absolutely.
I give Apple a lot of credit.
Well, I agree with you. As somebody who has been at the kind of receiving end of what went on there, I was involved in producing and making records at the time that was going on, and it seemed to me that there was a complete arrogance on the part of record companies. They refused to accept that the public wanted something that was inexpensive, they wanted something that was instant, and they wanted something that was simple to operate. And the labels could have actually been a lot more involved than they ended up being, and Apple took the glory.
Totally. Yes, I agree. And if you, with your background, you can remember back then, record companies were run by chubby accountants.
Yep,
and I use that as... Today, there are more people into music that become producers and start record companies, and it's more of an independent realm, which I think is better for the user. But you're right. It took so long for acceptance and the installed base to grow. But Apple did do it right. I've been involved with Apple Computer in one form and the other since 1980 to 2012, from building their first successful word processor as a third-party developer, to making parts that go inside Apple, to I was a expert witness in the Samsung, Apple versus Samsung case in 2010, 2011, 2012.
Amazing. You early on had the belief that high-speed data transmission would change the world, but you did have a lot of trouble, didn't you, getting others to share your vision?
Oh, yes. You know, typically in Silicon Valley, you go around and you get venture capitalists. Venture capitalists really they didn't want to, my deal scared them. Some of them personally invested, but they wouldn't invest their funds. I got turned down by all of them. And I ended up raising the first $8 million, $25,000 at a time from just many Silicon Valley angels. You know, then we went public and raised a lot of money.
And of course, audiohighway.com, which you started, was the leading internet radio site in the world. And look at internet radio now. Yes,
it was. I remember doing the first download, and we did the first cybercast on my site, nathanschulhof.com. There's some videos. We actually, in 1999, rented Dodger Stadium, hired Britney Spears, Ricky Martin, Will Smith, did an all-day concert with 80,000 people in stands, but broadcast to over 2 million people on a phone line. I mean, wow. Back then, we weren't sure how it was going to come out. It came out great. And Entertainment Tonight copied it. You can see a short clip of it on my site, nathanschulhof.com.
What about the legality of the whole thing, Nathan? And this is something that is now rambling on, particularly with streaming services, which you're very familiar with, like Spotify and people like YouTube. They really haven't been that fair to the music business, which holds them up and supports them. What's your view on that? And what was your view early on about how the legality of all this would work?
Well, one, I believe that artists should be paid and royalties need to be paid. I've never believed in stealing content. AudioHighway.com was always one that paid their artists. On the other hand, I do believe content needs to come down in price.
Yep. And
these sites are driving it down. And I think legislation will eventually, it's come a long way with laws from where it was like the Wild Wild West back in when I did this. I remember many meetings with the RIAA and working with them very closely to try to help iron some of this out. Quite frankly, where I see a real problem today more than legislation is the morality of this. Are we spending too much time online? Is this taking away from our life? And I think these are real issues. Is Facebook the biggest part of our life? Which I happen to like Facebook, but we need more reality in our life, less computers.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with you. And what about you these days? Then, what is? You're a serial entrepreneur, therefore you don't stop being an entrepreneur, do you? So, what are you up to these days?
Energy. I started a company called Solar Components that put out a leading solar charger called Solar Juice, JOOS. Won some awards at the Consumer Electronics Show. But these days I'm involved with, I try to work with things since my coma that make a difference in people's lives. Yeah. We were producing power supplies for people in Africa and India who had no energy. I'm somewhat involved with stem cell research. I like to do things that make a difference. And on the other hand, I love living on the Baja. I take long walks on the beach every day. If I lived any closer to the water, I would get wet.
And you describe in the book that your life has been a series of dysfunctional yet mostly successful events. That's an interesting description.
Thank you. It's the truth. I wanted to write this book. Like I said, I'm not a writer, but I think I had a story to tell, a different story. And people who read it come back and it surprises me that I'm still alive, that I was able to succumb these events. But at the end of the day, what I think drives us all is passion. I think if you can have passion for what you do and you're committed to it, you can be successful. Quite frankly, I don't think I'm any smarter than most anybody else. I'm committed, and I have passion. I live, breathe, and feel life in whatever I do. Well, and I think you'll hear this in the stories I tell in this book.
Absolutely. Well, if people want to find out more, the book is called Father of the Mp3 Player. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Nathan. Long may you enjoy Mexico and Baja, and it's been lovely to spend some time with you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.